I think this also sends a very strong signal to Vladimir Putin and Kremlin, who hopes that the West will get tired of supporting Ukraine.
But what also about Ukraine? You'll remember that Donald Trump promised several times that he'd end the war in his first 24 hours in office. Well, what impact will he have? The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer pledged to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position on a trip to Kyiv yesterday, where he signed a landmark 100-year pact with the country. A trip made, I'm sure, deliberately ahead of Trump's inauguration. Let's find out more. Sean Bell, the military analyst and host of the Red Matrix podcast, is here. Sean, good morning.
Good morning to you, Rosie.
How has Zelensky then been preparing for Donald Trump's reappointment as US president?
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, ultimately, we'll only speculate because I can't get inside Zelensky's mind. But now, having been to Ukraine recently myself, it's pretty clear this is going to be very difficult times. I mean, if you sit back from the war in Ukraine, a year ago we were more positive about Ukraine's chances, but the last year Russia's been on the front foot. It's been grinding its way forward, seizing territory very slowly at huge cost, but it has been seizing territory. And now, of course, there's the prospects that Donald Trump says originally he said he'd solve the Ukraine crisis in 24 hours. Some of his people are now saying it'll take several months. The harsh reality is that nobody can force President Zelensky to give up. Nobody can force any halt to this, and quite frankly, with President Putin on the front foot, why would he stop at the moment? So I suspect there aren't the dynamics for an easy solution to this, and President Zelensky will be trying to cultivate whatever support he can from whoever is out there available, just in case President Trump decides to turn the tap off of support for Ukraine.
Well, he certainly had warm words from Keir Starmer yesterday. You say turning the tap off. I mean, the big problem will be if the US reduce aid to Ukraine, might that force Zelensky's hand in some way?
Well, yeah, I mean, when we say aid, there's a couple of things here, one of which is money. And, there's been, Ukraine is particularly well sort of capitalized money-wise from the EU and also other international bodies. The problem is weapons, and quite frankly, it's the US have the biggest supplies of weapons, and that's the bit that's going to hurt the most. A lot of my military colleagues had originally said that 2024 was going to be a difficult year, but that Western defence industries was spinning up, and 2025 the tap would turn on. The harsh reality is, though, that I sense people are sniffing the potential of an end time for this conflict, and therefore, why would you spin up defence industries at great cost if just at the time they're generating all these weapons, they're no longer required? So I think there are some really difficult times ahead. I was at a EU conference. I was there in Brussels only a couple of days ago, and they were wrestling with this because there's fragmenting unity now amongst the West. Everybody, like Sir Keir Starmer, is saying publicly, we've got to back Ukraine to the end, but actions speak louder than words, and already some European countries are starting to open up lines of communication to Russia. Already people are saying, okay, when the war is over, we want to be at the front of the queue with Russia for lucrative contracts. And that's not helpful to President Zelensky's cause. So I think it's going to be a very, very difficult few months. And at least the sort of Trump coming in, there's this sense of unpredictability in the same way that I don't think it's coincidence that Netanyahu has finally agreed to some sort of ceasefire in Israel. It'll be interesting to see whether that unpredictability and Trump's unique style might have a way of unlocking some sort of lasting peace in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, we're going to be live in Tel Aviv in a moment or two to look at exactly what's been happening. We've heard more details from Netanyahu just in the last couple of hours, actually, so we'll have an update there. On Ukraine, the sort of mood music is suggesting that the US may start pushing Ukraine to make peace. You've said, Sean, that, why would Zelensky want to do that if they're currently losing territory? But is at some point some form of negotiation going to be inevitable?
Well, frankly, Rosie, wars like this either end when one side wins, the other side loses, or both sides get to the position where they've ground to some sort of stalemate and they see benefits in bringing the war to an end. Now, at the moment, Ukraine hasn't lost, Russia hasn't won, If you ask both sides what winning looks like, we're a million miles away from that. And they haven't ground to a halt because, if you're President Putin, you still have advantage. So quite frankly, there aren't even the sort of ingredients for any form of stoppage just yet. But inevitably, wars like this have to be concluded with some form of negotiation. And the question there is, what are the palatable ways of bringing it to a halt? But to be brutally honest, and it doesn't sound nice, but until President Putin has achieved his objectives, it's quite difficult to see why he would negotiate a halt to this. It's quite difficult to see what Trump can put on the table unless he massively appeased Putin and said, right, we'll get rid of all of the sanctions. Oil is allowed to flow if you'll stop. And that would reward President Putin's
behaviour,
aggression.
of course, yeah.
It's very difficult to see how the international community, and if that was a way of solving it, it might create a short-term palliative. But my goodness, our national security would be compromised, because what would Iran, what would North Korea, what would China take away from that? That would compromise our national security if that was the way this was brought to an end.
Yeah, and the lesson would be learnt that, Putin in many ways got what he wanted.
Exactly.
There's a story in the Times this morning. I just wanted your sort of sense on this, Sean. They say a growing number of major defence projects, that's here in the UK, are over budget and unlikely to be delivered by their current deadline. And when we look at that in slightly broader context, they say just 2 of the Ministry of Defence 49 military programmes are running on time and on budget. That paints a slightly bleak picture. It doesn't suggest efficiency, capability, organisation.
No, and Rosie, this story it cycles around every year, doesn't it? Because the MOD traditionally struggles to get its projects in on time. Now, I'm not for 1 minute trying to defend MOD processes, but what we have to remember is the MOD doesn't buy paper clips. Most of these projects are innovative technology. It's the one area of defence where we have an asymmetric advantage. And if I was to make a sort of a bleak reference, I'd say, if our defence needs are a Klingon cloaking device, which isn't available at the moment, but we think that is possible to contract in the near future, then we have a go at doing that. The trouble is there's huge amounts of risk with some of these new innovative projects, and sometimes, as it appears at the moment, more of them than not don't actually get in on time or on budget. And the challenge here, of course, is how do you keep pace with technology? Ukraine has demonstrated that, particularly with drones, they're being adapted all the time. Adaptability, flexibility, and the exploitation of technology are not buzzwords for the MOD's procurement process. And I think that's something that the Defence Review is going to have a really good look at. It's been a perennial problem for the MOD, and we don't seem to be any closer to solving it just yet.
Sean, thank you so much. Sean Bell, the military analyst and host of the Red Matrix podcast, bringing us up to date.
Sergei Petukov is a former Deputy Minister for European Integration of Ukraine, and earlier he's told me how important this pact between the two leaders was.
Well, it's clearly a political agreement, and it is also symbolic, as you rightly stated. It is important the moment when it's been announced. As you know, the new President-elect Trump has been sending very ambivalent signals about his vision of how he should or should not support Ukraine. And within the EU, we've also heard many countries being ambivalent about helping Ukraine. And in this specific moment, this is very important that Britain, again, takes leadership and sends a very clear signal of support and partnership with Ukraine. So I think the immediate effect is going to be on the neighbors of the UK on both sides of Atlantic, showing that, well, this is the policy of the UK and others are invited to follow it. Apart from that, of course, this is a clear commitment there, which will be ratified by both parliaments, making it a legal obligation to provide military assistance to a very significant amount of money and armament. And I think this also sends a very strong signal to Vladimir Putin and Kremlin, who hopes that the West will get tired of supporting Ukraine. So this is going to be a very strong signal that nobody's going to get tired. And for the next 100 years, UK will stand by Ukraine in whatever it needs to to respond to the Russian aggression.
Yep, and that builds on the already £12.8 billion of support that the UK has either given or indeed pledged since this war was started by Russia. There was concern, and it was reported in the newspaper The Guardian in November, that Ukrainian officials felt that the great support that President Zelensky and Ukraine had received from former Prime Ministers Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson had not been replicated by the Starmer government. Have those fears now been allayed by this?
It seems very much so. What we've seen is that no matter who is currently leading the government in the UK, it remains within the national interests of the United Kingdom to support Ukraine. And this is what we aim to have in all of our Western allies. We're hoping to have bipartisan support in the US. We hope that EU will support Ukraine no matter what. And again, here we see that, the fears that were there about, how the UK position is going to change with the new government have been unsubstantiated. And we see that this is exactly what Ukraine hoped for. And UK has been the first to deliver this very important, step and symbolic agreement that reassures both Ukrainian and sends a strong signal to Kremlin.
So we've talked already about military support, but what about other forms of deepening relationship? For example, cultural and other forms of support. How much more should we expect to see between the two countries?
Well, this agreement also includes other types of cooperation, one of them being cultural exchange and a commission that would support cultural projects in both countries. Also, there's going to be a dialogue on migration and possible easing of the visa requirements. And I think all of this together is aimed at really bringing Ukraine closer to the British people and giving them an opportunity to interact and learn more about each other. And I think that's a great thing because, we are on both sides of Europe, and it takes an effort to bring those countries together, especially that Ukraine has been under the Russian sphere of influence for so many centuries that, British people had no chance to learn much about Ukrainian culture and people. And the support that we're getting, I think, is also based a lot on the personal stories that, you can hear in the press and personal encounters that the British people might have, seeing how Ukrainian people are suffering from the aggression, but at the same time responding to that and defending their own country. So I think these types of exchanges are just as important to ensure that there's a bridge, human bridge between the UK and Ukraine.
And Sergei, you're the former Deputy Minister of European Integration of Ukraine. How hopeful are you that this big statement by Britain today is going to kickstart or reignite some passion from other European countries who are a little bit more ambivalent about the extent of their either financial or military relationship with Ukraine?
I'm very positive. We've seen that happening before where, Britain would be one of the first countries to take support of Ukraine one step further, along with Baltic states and along with the Nordic states. And, even while, Britain was within the EU, it was supportive of Ukraine. Now, it's been outside, it can take those steps quicker. It doesn't have to wait for other countries to be persuaded. But definitely everybody's looking at what Britain does on both sides of Atlantics, and this inspires other countries. And we've seen some sort of competition between different countries in devising new ways of supporting Ukraine and or sanctioning Russia. And UK here has been quite active. For example, some of the sanctions against Russia has been blocked within the Union by Hungary, whereas there's no such opposition in the UK. And therefore, the sanction regimes that is imposed by Britain in some way has been more effective than the ones that were imposed by the European Union.
And how worried are you by the statements from Marco Rubio, the incoming US Secretary of State, saying that both Ukraine and Russia would have to make concessions? What do you think that might mean in practice?
No, it's very hard to say how this is going to be implemented. I think this is the rhetoric that invites Russia to some sort of negotiations. And in reality, we of course understand that if we are to negotiate, there will be concessions on both sides. What matters, though, is that what cards you have at hand. And you always have to remember that with Putin, you always have to play hard and be able to raise the stakes. He would not really buy any of this, humanistic arguments or human rights arguments. He will only respond to the sheer power and will only step back when he has no resources to continue. So although, everybody will have to concede something at the negotiations, what Ukrainians are hoping is that the West collectively can show to Russia the consequence of a continuation of aggression and get a better deal for Ukraine in this way.